I'm Indy Neidell, and this is Out of the Foxholes, where I sit here, channeling the wisdom of my chair of infinite knowledge, which is somewhere in this room, and answer your questions about the Second World War. Just a reminder, Time Ghost Army members get prioritized or even guaranteed answers. More on that later. Our first question comes from Time Ghost Army Captain Patrick Quinn. Patrick asks us, I'd be curious how involved the Sicilian and mainland Italian Mafia was in the Allied invasions of Italy, and whether there was any split among these groups between the Axis and Allied forces. Okay, so it's pretty safe to say most of the Italian and Sicilian Mafia were pretty anti-Mussolini because his fascist regime fairly successfully cracked down on them. Unlike previous Italian governments, Mussolini would not tolerate any other organization wielding power that rivaled that of the state. From 1925, for example, he began a war of extermination against the mafiosi on Sicily, giving carte blanche to the prefect of Palermo, Cesare Mori, to destroy the crime syndicates. Using hundreds of carabinieri, police officers, militia, Mori led a campaign that included mass arrests, hostage-taking, and the confiscation or even destruction of property. His objective was not just to target the mafia, but to demonstrate to the people of Sicily that the state was more powerful than any crime organization. By the 1930s, the mafia was not necessarily destroyed, but pretty well suppressed there, and it would not regain its old significance until after the war. That's only part of the story, because there was, of course, the mafia in the States, and they were very much not eradicated. Soon after Pearl Harbor and the German declaration of war in December 1941, the U.S. government even turned to them for help. Oh yes. In February 1942, In February 1942, the ocean liner SS Normandy burned and sank in the port of New York while being converted to a troop ship. The fire will later be proven accidental, but at the time, the incident swelled pre-existing fears of enemy sabotage and of fascist sympathizers among the Italian-American dock workers. Hoping to secure the docks against such sabotage, the U.S. Navy Office of Intelligence turned to the Italian and Jewish mobsters who had great influence over the New York dock workers and unions. By this point, the Italian and Jewish mobs were pretty intertwined, and the two key figures for this here were Italian-born Charles Lucky Luciano, who agreed to cooperate in return for an early release from prison, and his Jewish associate Meyer Lansky. It is a bit hazy as to just what these guys actually did, though, and the whole thing just maybe became an officially sanctioned mafia protection racket and a great opportunity to remove U.S. government influence over the docks. But, at least in theory, the mafia were tasked with watching for infiltrators and fascist sympathizers, allowing intelligence agents to operate undercover in the ports and on land, preventing labor strikes, and using the fishing fleet to gather intelligence on U-boat refueling. Interesting side note, some people speculate that the mafia themselves ordered the burning of the Normandy, having correctly predicted that the government would appeal to them for help, and in doing so, allow the mafia to run things without interference. But that is mere speculation. You also asked about the Allied invasion of Sicily. Well, there were all sorts of myths and legends swirling about there. Supposedly, Luciano provided the military with photographs and maps of the Sicilian coastline and with Sicilian mafia contacts who would cooperate with the Allied forces. There are even stories that Luciano volunteered to be parachuted into Sicily with the Allied forces. The reality is this is probably tall tales propagated by some of Luciano's associates and by writers and historians, not historians, just by writers, in search of a dramatic story. The OSS did have contacts with the Sicilian Mafia, and there were some discussions about potentially arming them, but I don't think it went further than that. Most historians dismiss the idea that Allied forces actually sought any Mafia help in the States or in Sicily for the invasion. In fact, Luciano himself would later refute the idea that he could have aided the military at all, saying, "Back home, I didn't have a single contact." I'm going to move on to another question. I realize I only answered that about Sicily, and you asked about Italy, but I'll continue that another day. Time Ghost Army Captain John Schnell asks, are there any countries still at war from World War II? I've heard that Japan and Russia are trying to negotiate something having to do with islands from that time. Okay. The Soviet Union and Japan never really signed an actual peace treaty, although they did formally end their state of war in 1956. But they are still in dispute over the status of the Kuril Islands. This is a chain of 56 islands stretching about 1,300 kilometers northeast from Hokkaido in Japan up to the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia. In the 1875 Treaty of St. Petersburg, Russia and Japan agreed that Japan would have control of the Kurils in exchange for giving up its rights to Sakhalin Island. Then, after the Japanese victory in the Russo-Japanese War, the 1905 Treaty of Portsmouth gave Japan control of the southern half of Sakhalin. So, at the outbreak of World War II, the control of the islands looked like that. In the Yalta Agreement in February 1945, the Western Allies promised the Soviet Union that it could have the Kuril Islands and South Sakhalin in return for entering the war against Japan. Then, in the Potsdam Declaration in July 1945, the Allies announced that post-war Japanese sovereignty would be limited to the islands of Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku, and such minor islands as we determine. This vague sentence will cause all sorts of problems with different nations having very different ideas over who has the right to determine what. The Soviets do occupy the Kurils and all of Sakhalin, by which time the Japanese had already evacuated much of the population. The Soviets later also deport 17,000 Japanese from the Kurils. By January 1947, both were administered as Sakhalin Oblast. The Soviet control was seemingly ratified by the Treaty of San Francisco, which re-established peaceful relations between Japan and the Allied powers, and was signed in September 1951 by the US, Japan, and over 40 other nations. Although not actually by the Soviet Union for Cold War reasons. Anyway, this says, Japan renounces all right, title, and claim to the Kuril Islands, and to that portion of Sakhalin and the islands adjacent to it, over which Japan acquired sovereignty as a consequence of the Treaty of Portsmouth of the 5th of September 1905. This seems pretty cut and dry, and Japan did agree to recognize Soviet and then later Russian sovereignty over most of the Kuril Islands chain. But the issue is that there is no agreed-upon definition of which islands actually count as part of the Kuril Islands. See, Japan regards the islands closest to Hokkaido, Iturup, Kunashir, Shikotan, and the Habomai Islands, quite differently from the rest of the island chain. They say that these are not part of the Kuril Islands, but are the Northern Territories, and thus an integral part of the home islands, forming part of Hokkaido Prefecture. As such, Japan maintains a claim on them to this day, a position which is supported by the United States and the European Union. Japan has a similar dispute over the Senkaku Islands, this time with both the PRC, the People's Republic of China, and the ROC, the Republic of China. Both Chinese entities claimed these islands, arguing they were discovered and occupied by the Ming Empire in 1372. The Japanese claim the Senkakus were never actually settled by the Chinese at any point, and that they were actually first explored by a Japanese businessman in 1884 before being incorporated as part of Okinawa in January 1895. The Japanese further claimed that after this, the Chinese ceded any claim over the islands with the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which ended the Sino-Japanese War in April 1895. After the Second World War, the islands were administered by the United States, and for a long time, neither the PRC nor the ROC made much noise about the islands at all. But as the US prepared to hand back the islands, both made formal claims in 1971. They based these claims on that same ambiguous sentence in the Potsdam Declaration about Japanese sovereignty being limited to the islands of Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku, and such minor islands as we determine. Japan counters with the Treaty of San Francisco, but then the ROC and PRC say, well, they never signed that treaty, so they are not bound by it. It's quite a mess. In terms of other countries that still have disputes over World War II era issues, well, Korea was split in half by the Soviets and the Americans at the end of the war. The two Koreas didn't go to war until 1950, though there were plenty of clashes in the late 40s. And they're still technically at war today. If you want to see how that war began, you can head over to our Korean War channel, where I am currently covering that conflict week by week, much like I did World War II. I suppose you could say that a lot of pre-existing conflicts and disputes were put on hold at the end of the war. Communist Yugoslavia came out of the war, but we're still dealing with some of the fallout of the long and violent breakup in the 1990s. Well, same with the Soviet Union. It emerged stronger than ever out of the war, but the old fault lines were just waiting to reemerge. Like in Yugoslavia, these tensions, well, they've burst out since the collapse of the Union. Armenia and Azerbaijan, Caucasus Wars, Russia and Georgia, Russia and Ukraine. Similar to that, a lot of countries in Africa and Asia sought independence in the years following the war. The British, the French, the Portuguese fought various wars and counterinsurgencies against independence and communist movements. After many of those nations gained independence, all sorts of ethnic, religious, and political conflicts, which had been suppressed by the imperial powers, were unleashed and even turbocharged by the Cold War. Vietnam, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, just to name a few. Some of them are still going on. I mean, if World War II hadn't happened, we might not be having a civil war in Burma right now. The origins of the Israeli-Palestine conflict stretch a lot further back than World War II, but the Israeli state was created in the aftermath of the war and the Holocaust, and is very much a product of post-war international settlements. You can check out Sparty and Sebastian's video from last year on the Time Goes channel for an in-depth look at that. Okay, very long answer for that one. But it's the sort of question that opens up like loads of rabbit holes, right? Okay, next question comes from another Time Ghost Army captain, RIOV or Riov 26, who asks, what kind of requirements did men have to meet physically if they wanted to join Japan's Special Naval Landing Forces? And once in basic training, what did SNLF recruits go through before they graduated boot camp? Well, I can't really give you an answer as to the precise physical requirements, but perhaps I can give everyone a bit more information about the SLNF as a whole instead, and how it was tied to Japanese imperial expansion. So I'm cheating and not answering your question, but answering a variant of your question. Okay, so the Special Naval Landing Forces were naval infantry of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And although they are often referred to as Marines, they're actually quite different from the Western concept of Marines, though influenced by them. The differences are pretty apparent when you look at their origins. In the 1870s, the Japanese began the process of raising naval landing forces from individual ships, ranging from a sixth to a third of the ship's crew, assembled and deployed in time of need. Several ships could combine these naval landing forces into a combined naval landing force. Such forces saw action in the First Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, the First World War. The main difference compared to the traditional idea that we have of Marines is that the naval landing forces were originally employed only as temporary forces, being raised and disbanded as needed for operations. They were not capable of the same long-term expeditions or engagements that their Western counterparts were, although this did change somewhat as this war went along. And the naval landing forces remained an integral part of the Japanese Navy, and the soldiers and officers used standard naval ranks. Although I can't tell you about physical requirements, I can tell you most naval landing force troops went through the same training as normal sailors. The main difference is that all Japanese sailors received at least some training in ground combat, unlike their Western counterparts. Some naval landing troops did have more specialized training, including like artillery gunners, tank crews, and as paratroops. Okay, but what about the Special Naval Landing Forces? What makes them special? Well, these started as naval landing forces, which were formed at naval bases, or naval districts to be precise, rather than drawn from the ships themselves. Again, these forces were often disbanded when no longer needed, but there was one SNLF for which this certainly was not the case. On February 1st, 1927, the Japanese Navy's first expeditionary fleet landed about 300 men in Shanghai to assist in evacuating civilians from the Shanghai International Zone in the middle of the fighting between the National Revolutionary Army and the local Chinese warlords. Further reinforcements arrived over the coming months, and the force reached brigade strength, with 2,200 men organized into 7 battalions. Along with a handful of field guns, they were even reinforced with armored cars. Tensions subsided in the late 1920s and the force was reduced, But after the Japanese army invaded Manchuria in September 1931, tensions in Shanghai escalated into fighting between the SNLF and the Chinese 19th Route Army in January 1932. Soon, the Shanghai force was up to 4,400 men, and they forced the Chinese to retreat from the zone in March. The following year, this force was declared an independent unit and garrisoned permanently in the city as the Shanghai Special Naval Landing Force. They were equipped with Type 89 tanks, armored cars, field guns and howitzers, and other artillery. In the Battle of Shanghai in August 1937, the SNLF were deployed across the city, fighting especially hard until the Japanese army showed up in force. After the victory, the SNLF helped to capture other ports and cities near Shanghai like Qingdao. By that point, the Japanese had established several other special naval landing forces. There were SNLFs established in Yokosuka, Sasebo, and Kure. Unlike the Shanghai force, though, these were only battalion-sized with under 600 men each. During Japanese offensives on the coast of China between 1937 and 39, these forces would be raised, deployed, and disbanded after achieving specific objectives. This pattern continued after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the expansion in the Pacific. By November 1941, there were 11 Naval District SNLFs, 3 stationed permanently in China, and 8 ready for combat in the Pacific. By early 1942, these units had captured objectives in Borneo, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island, the Bismarck Archipelago. During the invasion of the Dutch East Indies, SNLF paratroops dropped at Langoan Airfield in Manado and near Penfui Airfield on Timor. In June 1942, men of the SNLF also landed on Kiska Island in the American Aleutians. Things changed, though, after defeat in the Battle of Midway and the failure to cap Milne Bay in New Guinea checked Japanese expansion. Without naval supremacy to cover ground operations, the Japanese Navy's land forces shifted to a more defensive role, where the rapid deployability of the SNLF became less useful. Instead, they began sacrificing speed for heavier firepower and air defense capabilities. Such defensive SNLFs saw service in the Solomons, the Nicobars, and across the southeastern Pacific. In the final months of the war, 19 naval districts on the home islands, along with Chinkai Guard District in Korea, raised almost 50,000 SNLF troops as last-ditch defenders. Unlike earlier units, though, these were more like reorganizations of existing forces manned with leftover personnel and substandard weaponry. With Japan surrendering before the Allied invasion of the home islands, these SNLFs did not see any action. This was a very long episode, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, but there were 3 questions that sort of inspire length, and I didn't even go into the mainland Italian Mafia. Well, so that's for another time. And yes, this is another thrilling episode of Out of the Foxholes with questions about the Mafia, Japanese naval infantry, and countries for whom World War II never ended. You know where else World War II never really ends? I'm not going to say right in my heart, because it did. Right here on the World War II channel, of course. Our week-by-week coverage of the regular episodes is finished, but we will continue bringing you more episodes of Out of the Foxholes, more special episodes on people, hardware, doctrines, all the good stuff. And we have our new chronological series, The Rise of Hitler. If you have a question for Out of the Foxholes, head on over to community.timeghost.tv, or better yet, join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. It is thanks to the Time Ghost Army we can keep doing what we do, and if you subscribe at captain level or above to the Army, you'll get a guaranteed answer to your question. But I will remind you once again, as many of you know, do not leave your questions in the comment section below the video. They will not be answered. I mean, if you ask them somewhere else and also do, but I'll probably go, when I read the question down there. Those you'll be left just waiting around for a resolution like some kind of disputed Pacific island after the Second World War. Okay, well, once again, I am Indy Neidell. This has been Out of the Foxholes. See you next time.